Now we are going to deep dive into the topical standards, and the first set is environmental standards, the long-awaited environmental standards, which include 5 key standards. And again, this picture you've already seen, and you will see it again and again. This shows the entire set of ESRS and where environmental standards are positioned. And we speak about climate change, pollution, water and marine resources, biodiversity and ecosystems, and resource use and circular economy. I will go through the climate change, and Simon will present you other environmental standards and the key highlights of them. Environmental standards and climate change standard in particular follow again the logic which was already laid out and explained in ESRS 1 and 2. They talk about strategy, governance, materiality assessment as the first starting points. So this is the structure which goes through the entire set of standards. For strategy, governance and materiality assessments, all the undertakings and preparers have to explain how they set up governance, how they set their strategy, and perform materiality assessments for the climate risks. I guess I cannot imagine even company or undertaking which might not have climate change in their reporting, or might scope it out based on materiality assessments. These are the standards perhaps which will be reported and disclosed by all undertakings. And on this slide you will also see references to other reference points, regulations and legislation, which is a very important element to remember, because climate change and this area already has quite a wide range of various regulations around it, and the standards combines them all to bring them in one comprehensive picture. Here you will see the elements of a risk assessment. For those who are familiar with the recommendations of TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures, you will see elements familiar to you. The standard speaks about physical and transition risks and assessment of exposure of companies to those risks. And this comes back in the standards very loudly, because that's where we all need to start. And of course, based on the risk assessment, we need to build our resilience plans and show how we are going to mitigate and tackle those. Important elements of this standard, which also distinguishes it from other standards, is disclosure requirements related to the transition plan. So entities, the undertakings, are supposed to and asked to have a transition plan, which will include the following elements: alignment of greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, and the standard speaks about 1.5 degree scenario, which is the goal of the EU, decarbonization levers, financial resources, and it's a very important element. We have to prove that we walk the talk, that we actually allocate specific investments and resources to the transition plan. We also need to disclose information about locked-in greenhouse gas emissions, make references to the requirements of EU taxonomy, and also show, again similar to other standards, how this is aligned to the overall business strategy and how the whole process is intertwined. So please pay attention to this part. It's a very important element of the standard. The other elements follow again the logic of ESRS. They speak about policies, targets, action plans, and resources allocated to it. And here again on this slide you will see what requirements, and very detailed requirements, the standard has to disclosures of these elements. Again, coming back to the transition plan, please note the standard is not only talking about transparency again, not only disclosure of your actual position. It is talking about how we are going to move to 1.5 degree scenario. It is asking undertakings to develop their strategy in line with this strategy, with this overall EU strategy, and that's a very important element of it. When we talk about the targets, the standards again outlines which exactly targets we talk about. First of all, it asks to have the targets. This is the first very important element. It not only asks to transparently disclose where you are, but we do need to have targets. All climate-related greenhouse gas emission production targets, net zero targets, and neutrality claims that involve the use of carbon credits. So these are very important, again, elements, because all these need to be, first of all, in place, and secondly, disclosed accordingly. On this slide, you can see an example on what this path to the, for example, net zero can look like and which elements it can include. We will share this presentation so that you can see in detail what examples can be, and of course in the application guidance to the standards you can see more detailed instructions on how this should be organized. Next point, and again following the logic of the standards, is the performance measures. So what do we need to disclose? And the standards outlines quite a lot of requirements here. So we do have a lot of metrics and accordingly data points, which will be quite a big challenge even for companies who are already advanced in their carbon reporting. Here we speak about energy consumption and mix, intensity, absolute emissions, scope 1, 2 and 3, total emissions, greenhouse gas removals, credits and other elements of it. So please again pay attention to those. And since we mentioned scope 1, 2 and 3, please note standard requires disclosures of scope 3. This is a big discussion point of all the, quite all I would say, preparers, because this is emissions of the, outside our own operations, outside our own productions, both upstream and downstream. This always a big challenge point in terms of course, data collection, because it comes from third parties, how we should organize this, how we get primary data, how we avoid estimates used or any other assumptions. So, but standard requires us to disclose it. So again, be very attentive to this part. And going further, other requirements include also financial effects. So we made an assessment of physical and transition risks. We see where they impact our business, but we also need to disclose what the financial impact will it have on our operations. Again, for those who practice TCFD, for example, recommendations, is one of the most challenging points, how we make a reliable and a consistent and comparable disclosure of financial impacts of those risks.
And the link to your financial statements.
And the link to your financial statements, which is a good challenge, but of course, it's a very important point for investors and other stakeholders to see how it will impact your company in line with all the other risks, like credit risks or any other financial risks. And of course, taxonomy, EU taxonomy regulation comes back again. For those who are familiar with it, or ESRS also require disclosures of EU taxonomy, which is of course much more elaborated in the taxonomy itself. We spoke already about the risks, and again, several other slides will outline how all these assessments need to be done, some specific requirements, to the, for example, to the carbon credits, because we know it's quite a sensitive point in any strategy towards net zero, but standard again outlines for all of us how this should be addressed and disclosed accordingly. With that, I think we covered one of the most challenging, and it was the most again expected climate change standards, and I will give word to Simon.
Yeah, but only after you answer a question I have to you.
Oh yes, absolutely.
And that is, if you look at Heineken, and you've got very mature ESG reporting, and you win awards and everything. What is your key challenge if you look at this the standard on climate?
Good question. So of course we do already a lot of reporting, whether it's in our annual report. We also do disclosures in line with CDP, both climate and also water, which we will speak later on, where we already present a lot of information. But still, scope 3, as I mentioned, is one of the key challenges. And of course, there is a lot of debate how to get this information, for example, from your suppliers, or for us even from our customers, because they look at our cooling, for example, systems, which you see in the outlets or in the supermarkets. And scope 3, in my view, financial assessment, which we're doing, but this is still quite a big challenge, because it also needs to be, first of all, aligned fully with your strategy. It needs to be also, of course, reviewed by all your financial colleagues who are in charge of strategy and do make forecasts for the future. This cannot go in parallel because they have to be woven with each other. And of course, a lot of data points, because again, if you remember, all elements of ESRS need a subject to limited assurance for now.
Yep.
So to make them all audit-proof, to make them auditable, reliable, that's also, I would imagine, a big challenge for all of us.
That's great. So thank you for that. And also, again, I think the key message is also you cannot do this by yourself, really. You need to reach out to, you know, your colleagues that are working in risk management, for example, if you're working in a larger company, you know, your people in finance, because you need to assess the financial risks. And also to start talking to your accountant, really, because they should be familiar with all of that. They should help you also to get going. But don't wait until the first year of reporting, because there's a lot to be done for, you know, even mature companies like Heineken and Philips, and we really need to put a lot of time and effort into this. And we don't have that much time, because just to reiterate what Gerard said earlier, the year 2024 is the first year where you need to collect the data on, because it's the year that we as listed companies need to report on. If you're not listed, you have got 1 year extra. But you know, we're now in June 2022. Soon it will be January 23, and that's the first year. If you're exempted for the first year, you've got 2 years really. But if you don't have any system, policies, procedures, and everything, it's a lot of work, and there are many, many standards. And talking about that, I will take you now through 4 other environmental standards, but I will do that at a little bit of a higher pace, because not all of the standards are as applicable to everybody like the climate standard is. There are also, if you compare the standards, I would say the climate standard is the most mature one, also because there is a golden standard that is called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, against which most companies have been reporting, if you have been reporting on climate change, and CO2 emissions and what have you. Whereas for the others, there's a little bit less standards that would be considered as the golden standard. But let me take you through this. So on pollution, of course, a very big topic, and you know, you just need to open the newspapers and you know that this is a very material topic. Also linked to, for example, biodiversity, and again also the circular economy. So there's a lot of linkages between the different standards. And here you were being asked to talk about pollution and prevention, you know, the other elements in your supply chain again, which will be a little bit more of a challenge, because we in Philips know exactly what chemicals we are using and what kind of pollution there is, if any. But how can you make any statements about that in your supply chain, really, with a lot of comfort? There are also, again, just like in the slides that Olga showed, links to different other documents like the TCFD, the CSRD, and others that the EU or other bodies have published. Again, the same structure as we have in the slides of Olga. The disclosure requirements first deal with policies, targets, action plans, and resources. So you can't say, you know, we've got this great action plan and we're working on this with everybody in Philips, but we don't have any resources dedicated to it. So it should all be synchronized quite nicely. And also with regard to performance management, you know, and measurements, what do you really have in place? How well are you doing towards your targets? And we in Philips always set 5-year targets for our ESG program. So you've got a little bit of time to get everything going, but you need to have targets really in order to report on this in line with the pollution standard. And then again, a number of elements that you should disclose: pollutants to air, to water, to soil. I think in itself it's all, you know, completely sensible, and if we want to go to a more sustainable world, which we need, they all make sense. But you know, do all the individual disclosure requirements make that much sense, and do they apply to everybody or not? And to what level of detail should you go? And that is where we also ask you kindly to review this and come back to us with your comments. So that was the first standard that I will that I dealt with. So that's ESRS E2. Then we move over to ESRS E3, water. And also in the Netherlands, quite an interesting topic. On the one hand, it's now the summertime and people complain about the droughts already that we have in this great country. But we also had the flooding in Limburg and what have you. So it's a topic that also is coming quite close to all of us here in the Netherlands. And we as a country have quite a large marine history as well. But let's talk about the requirements here. And it's on the one hand water and water use, but also the impact on marine resources. So, you know, that could be the North Sea, it could be, you know, if you have activities in Indonesia, you know, is there an impact that you have on the oceans over there, and what have you. Again, the same structure when it comes to the disclosure requirements, policies, targets, action plans, and resources. And again, assuming that this is a material topic to your company, which in Heineken it definitely is, else we wouldn't have beer. But in Philips it's a little bit less, and we need to deal with, we need to think about how we're going to report on all of this, and whether the rebutable presumption will prevail, or whether we can just claim, you know, it's not a material topic, so we're not going to report on water. Be it that we still always disclose in our annual report, you know, the water consumption, the discharge of water, etc., but at a higher level than the full 9 yards that are being explained in the water standard. And then again, a little bit of an overview of the detailed disclosure requirements, the risk and opportunities. You know, you've got specific business activities that have a strong link to water and marine resources, of course, then you need to definitely go all the way in your disclosures. And here, the last slide on the disclosure requirements, water management, intensity performance, so how much water do you consume per million euros of turnover, for example, and are there any marine resource related performance indicators that you have in the company? And again, you know, the standards ask you for all of this, and if you don't have any standards or policies or whatsoever, you need to explain why and when you're going to have all of that. So that was on water, and then at high pace we continue with biodiversity. To my opinion, and I think many in the audience as well, one of the other big societal topics. I think it's climate change, it's biodiversity, and it's social inequality. Those are the big three topics, I think, at society at large. And with regard to the deteriorating biodiversity, the EU has got a number of plans in place, and what is interesting about this standard and some of the other standards as well, they've got strong linkages to the plans of the EU. And the interesting part is those plans don't have any legal status, they are a plan, but the reporting requirements will be mandatory. They're basically a legal requirement. So here, you know, one way or the other, you know, plans and legal requirements have been intertwined and mixed, and we'll see how all of that works out in the nearby future. But with regard to biodiversity, you need to explain really what interactions you have yourself with terrestrial freshwater and marine habitats, ecosystems, and what have you. Again, a very material topic for Heineken and many other companies in the world. For Philips, you know, more in the supply chain than in our own operations, where we've got a limited number of factories really that are quite, you know, or less impactful when it comes to biodiversity than some other companies maybe. So again, the same structure, and you will get a little bit tired of me sounding like a broken record, but it's again strategy, governance, material assessments, and you'll also see that coming back here in this specific standard. But interestingly, we already referred to the climate standard as the one where there is a golden standard, the greenhouse gas protocol. With regard to biodiversity, there is not yet that, you know, surviving standard. Still, there is a disclosure requirement that we have here and that I'm presenting to you. So again, policy targets, action plans, resources, and performance management. And there are a number of elements in the disclosure requirements, like pressure metrics, impact metrics, response metrics, etc., etc. So there's a lot, you can read about it, but there's a lot of references also in those to those emerging standards. So that is where this specific biodiversity standard is coming in. You also need to, again, explain methodologies, metrics used, and that reinforces some of the key messages that Olga and myself are trying to convey to you. If you all add it up, you know, one individual standard is maybe a lot of work, but if you all bundle them, it's an awful lot of work. And you know, every individual one, if you think about a medium-sized company and you need to report on biodiversity, this would take you at least a resource for a specific period of time to get all the data to the table. And again, considering those 1 or 2 years that you have, 2023, 24, it's not a lot of time, so better get started soon. And where you would normally start is with your materiality assessment, because if you are a company like Randstad and you need to disclose on biodiversity, probably it does not apply that much to you. So if you can already pinpoint that in your materiality assessment, that also means that you don't have to dive into the details of the biodiversity standard, and you can just focus more on the social standards, which make, of course, much more sense than that. Hey, then coming to the last standard, E5, on resource and circular economy, a topic very close to the heart of Philips, because we think the circular economy is very important. We need to decouple economic growth from the use of resources. We're consuming more than one planet at this moment as well, and we see the devastating effects of that. So here again, a number of requirements, and the slide tells you more, and also there's reference to all kinds of other documents in the standard itself. But as I said, you know, we try to decouple economic growth from the extraction of natural resources. Again, policies, targets, action plans, and resources. And if you then look at the disclosure requirements, quite interesting and a challenge to us in Philips, but also to many others, I think, is that you need to provide a material balance. So what is the weight of the goods and services? Well, services don't have normally a weight, but the weight of your goods that you're purchasing that come into your company. What do you then do with it, and what do you put on the market? And the number of metrics that you need to have there. A lot of details also on waste, you know, hazardous waste and all kind of others. What is being recycled, what not. And I think they make sense as a disclosure requirement, but not everybody, including ourselves, have all our ducks in a row yet to disclose on this. So a lot of work also for Philips, that has already 4 or 5 years history in the circular economy, if not more. And then I think for some of you also a lot of work to be done still. Good guidance in the document itself on, you know, how do you define the material inflows and the outflows and what have you, but worth a read. And with that, I come to the end of the 4 standards that I dealt with, and together we have given you an overview of the 5 standards.
Yes, but I will ask you a question, Simon, because 5 standards, of course, on a very important and high priority topics. For companies starting reporting, it will be overwhelming, especially when they realize that by materiality assessment, everything is applicable for them. From your experience in Philips and maybe general understanding of this, what would you recommend to companies starting with implementation of those?
Yeah, that's a great question, but also a difficult one to answer, because we have been working on this for, you know, at least 10, 15 years already in the company. But what I would do, and you would say, assuming that all the 5 standards apply to you, there are companies where this will be the case, but there will be the majority where it will not be the case. So start again with your materiality assessment and come to the conclusion that, for example, maybe all the 5 standards are applicable, but maybe also only the climate standard. And if you do that, you know where to focus. And if you have the bad luck that they all apply to you, well, you better do that materiality assessment in a timely manner, so you can also start organizing your resources to address all of that. Then I would say, you know, if you don't have the expertise yourself and you know, you read the standards, I think it will be a huge challenge to start working on them, because it's, you know, far-fetched. And for example, with regard to biodiversity, you know, how many people do have ecologists in their company, and maybe some have, but some don't. So there are quite some experts that you can go to, but solicit that input in a timely manner, because you're not the only company. In the Netherlands, there are about, we estimate some 3,500 companies that are subject to the CSRD. So there's definitely a big demand for, you know, all kind of experts, consultants, accountants, and what have you. So, you know, assess what is relevant for you and search for help really to get going. And then during that effort, you will come to the conclusion where the complexity will be. Will it be in your supply chain, for example? But also look at what other companies are doing. I know that Heineken has been doing a great job on biodiversity, for example, and water. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel yourself. Look at the number of bigger companies, and maybe Gerard will allude to efforts we can do as can take as a Dutch accounting standards board, but also pointing to a number of good examples, because don't reinvent the wheel, really. That is, I think, a very important answer. Hopefully that...
Yeah, cannot agree more. And again, advice, go to a business. You might find out that there is a lot out there already, because operations, sales, HR, they might already do a lot on it, and it will be a matter of combining this all together.
Yeah. And don't forget, we all do this for, you know, a more sustainable future, not only for ourselves, but also for the children and everything that will come after us. So thank you so much, and then this is the end of the environmental session. Thank you.